I've been playing Trials of Fire off and on for the last month, and a lot of unique things this game does really well. At the same time, it has some drawbacks that kept me from playing the game more. I'm going to do a deep dive in this video into what Trials of Fire is, what I like about the game, and where I think it could use some improvement. So let's get into it. Trials of Fire is a unique tactical RPG deck builder roguelite hybrid. You control a party of 3 characters, and you fight enemies in a turn-based hex grid battlefield. Each of your characters has a unique deck, and you use each character's cards to get them to move, attack, or apply other effects such as conditions or powers. Within each turn, you're also actively managing willpower, which is a resource you use to play cards. The game has a lot of cool mechanics and choices that add depth and strategy to the gameplay. For example, within each turn you can redraw cards, discard cards for willpower, discard cards to give your units armor and protect against incoming damage, or discard cards to move a unit around. And like any other tactical game, the placement of your heroes matters a lot, and managing their positioning is incredibly important. Many attacks can only be done from certain positions, and other attacks have a set hit pattern from your hero, such as the Frost Sphere card that hits every character in a line, including your own units if you're not careful. Additionally, you can perform combo attacks if you position your heroes correctly, allowing you to do more damage, and the enemy can do the same to you as well, so you have to plan around that and try to strategize there. I have some more minor complaints with the gameplay, such as limited controllability of summons, and the overall slightly slow pacing of the game, but as a whole, the tactical and deck building elements mix really well to create satisfying combat. It feels like you have a lot of options each turn with how you play things out, because you can use cards in 4 different ways, and this adds a real feel of depth and strategy to it. Outside of the actual combat, you manage your characters by leveling them up, which allows you to upgrade or modify their core decks, or by giving them equipment, which adds new cards to their decks, as well as extra health or additional redraws, depending on the equipment that you use. If you get a legendary armor or weapon, it also comes with a powerful build-defining effect, and outside of normal card combos, this is one of the biggest area where builds come in. As an example, one legendary effect makes all close range spells deal more damage. So you would want to give that hero with that effect more close range spells, and then use that character more aggressively to get in close and deal more damage. To do that, you might seek out more movement abilities for that character as well. In this game, there are 9 characters or heroes you can unlock, and each class has a different talent that has an important but often small effect to it, such as the Elementalist effect that makes the first card played each turn cost 1 fewer willpower. Each character has a different core deck and unique cards that come along with it. However, each type of equipment can be used by multiple different classes. So while the core deck has some unique cards that are unique to that class, equipment is not unique to any one class and can be used by multiple. Because of that, there are times you can play 2 different characters, end up with nearly identical final builds because you use the same equipment. I do think that classes as a whole feel different from each other in a good way, and a couple of them have some cool core mechanics, such as the character that focuses on RNG, or the character that steals enemy cards to use them against them. But I still found sometimes that different characters would end up feeling very similar because of the impact of equipment, and especially legendary items, can have on your build. Trials of Fire also has a lot of different game modes, which is actually a really great feature of the game because it allows you to play the game slightly differently depending on your preferences and what you really like about the game or what you don't. But for the most part, the game modes play pretty similarly. The core combat is the same in all game modes, and what really changes is the goals of each run and what happens between fights. Most game modes, including the main Trials of Fire game mode, the one that the game is named after, include an overworld between fights. In this overworld, you move around different terrains to find different events and complete objectives or short quests that go along with those events. It's pretty simple mechanically, and most events present you with a simple choice between options, with some cost, some reward, some combination of them, or some random chance of getting something. Between events, you also need to manage your party's energy by collecting and using food, gearing up your heroes between fights, as I talked about earlier, and there's some other smaller things you do between fights as well, such as managing your hero's injuries and those kind of things. As a whole, I liked the overworld in small amounts, but it also felt a little monotonous to me after a while, and I felt like I was spending way too much time in the overworld, relatively speaking, compared to fighting, compared to the combat. But you kind of have to do that. You need to complete the events and gear up and level up your heroes so you can actually defeat the bosses when you get to them, but importantly, there is also a second timer of sorts that limits how much time you can spend between boss fights. If you don't get to the next boss quick enough, you fail your run. Still, the farming up and leveling up of heroes within each run felt a little tedious to me at times, and I would say that's my biggest criticism of the core game modes. It just has slow pacing, which made me want to play the game less, and it made the game less bingeable. However, as I mentioned earlier, there are different game modes, and that includes a combat-focused game mode that doesn't have an overworld, though it does have a limited number of between combat events. I did enjoy this game mode a lot, though it almost swung too much in the other direction. I think that I want an overworld, but I want it to be more engaging and less repetitive than the one that's present in the game right now. The last thing that I'll say in this section is that the runs in this game are relatively long and often take between 1 and 2 hours to complete if you're successful. However, you can also save mid-run, which is great, so you never have to give up on a run even if you have to go do something else and put down the game. Now let's talk about RNG and randomness in Trials of Fire, which should make the game feel novel, run after run, that can be frustrating if done poorly. The two biggest sources of RNG in Trials of Fire are what events you find in the overworld and what type of builds you're going to be able to make. In terms of events, when you run around the overworld, every event is a question mark, so you don't know what you're going to get. Events can be fights, give certain items, or give you options where you make a choice that decides how the event plays out, often with potential cost and potential benefit if things go well. Getting good events can be incredibly helpful, such as an event that gives you great loot at no cost, but you rarely ever feel screwed over by the events. They're often not unilaterally bad. Additionally, if you mouse over events, you can see a likelihood of certain things happening, so you know what you're getting into in a rough sense before you get there, which is a nice counter RNG measure. You don't know what it's going to be, but you know some likelihood of different things happening. But at the same time, you'll also get pretty familiar with all of the events pretty quickly. And even the occasional side quests you get from events felt stale and samey to me after a while. The other biggest area of RNG is in the equipment you can find and the card options you get when leveling up. In other words, how good can your deck and synergies be? I think Trials of Fire does decent with this. You can create some builds that can be effective and satisfying, and getting one of those synergies working is incredibly fun. But there are also times where it feels like you just can't really create a certain build that you want, or maybe more accurately, if you really want a certain build, whether because you just want to do that for fun, or because you have a certain legendary weapon that really warrants a certain playstyle or certain cards, it's very difficult to reliably get that build. For example, I had a game where the best legendary weapon I could pick had a legendary effect that dealt more damage to enemies with the chill condition, but I only found one other card that inflicted chill throughout my run, which was incredibly disappointing and diminished that typical fun deck building nature a little bit. Another source of RNG is in what cards you draw, but there are a lot of counter RNG measures here, such as being able to remove undesirable cards between runs by different means, and the ability to redraw cards a limited number of times in each combat, as well as being able to discard cards for other effects, as I talked about earlier. And finally, there are certain characters or heroes that have more baked in RNG, such as the Alchemist that has many cards that deal damage within a certain range, such as between 1 and 3 damage as opposed to just 2. You never have to play those characters. If you want to avoid them, you can. And of course, conversely, if you want that randomness, if you want that RNG playstyle, you can seek out those heroes deliberately. So as a whole, RNG in Trials of Fire is good. I think that the events have a great balance mechanically of RNG and information. Though they do feel a little stale after a while in terms of variety, I wish there was more there that kept the events lively run after run. In terms of builds, I wish it was slightly easier to create reliable synergies, but the game does a good job of making each run feel different. You can't always just run the same build, or even really the same type of build with every run. Cross-run progression in Trials of Fire comes in the form of unlocks and climbable difficulty levels. In terms of unlocks, the first main big unlock is unlocking each character so that you can play them. You start with 3 characters, and you can unlock 6 more for a total of 9. Each character has a specific challenge you need in order to unlock it. For example, one character requires you to complete a run in 3 different game modes in order to play that character. Additionally, as you play each character more, you increase their soul level, which unlocks new cards you can use for each character in future runs. This is a soft form of vertical progression because while it's not a direct buff to each character, the character isn't getting directly stronger, many of the later cards that you find are really good. So unlocking those cards can help you build a better deck with that character later on. You can also unlock new game modes, new legendary weapons as you play more, though I'm not quite sure how these unlocks work. They just kind of came to me and I wasn't sure how I got them. Finally, there's a form of vertical progression in Trials of Fire in terms of the difficulty levels you can climb called Cataclysm levels. Like similar mechanics in other roguelites, each level adds a new challenge, such as increased enemy health, that stacks with the challenges of previous levels. I haven't really climbed these difficulty levels personally, because I mostly enjoyed experimenting with other game modes and other hero types instead. So as a whole, I like the progression in Trials of Fire. I think that it has good pacing. My only annoyance with the progression in the game was feeling that I need to play a character a certain number of times before I can really see what potential that character has. Because so many later cards are just better or really build defining and build helping, you kind of need to unlock them to see what you can do with some characters. Now let's talk briefly about the narrative and story in Trials of Fire. One of the qualities that I really liked about the game was the atmosphere and lore in the world, which is set in a post-apocalyptic world. There are even some lore during game modes that let you explore different aspects of this world and learn more about it. Within each game mode, there's a main quest you progress as you go through the game, and in some game modes, it's even branching, so you can explore more depending on what choices you make. There are miscellaneous events you can encounter as well, as we talked about earlier, which don't progress the story, but do help with the world building. There's also a nice cutscene that opens up the game and really gives the game a good feel from the start. The game also has a tabletop quality to it, and all the characters, both allies and enemies, are tile pieces. There's also an animation of pieces falling onto the board and other book-centered animations in the game as you're playing on this book of sorts that you use for both the board and for the UI. I think this is a cool stylistic choice to the game, and I liked it overall. It felt unique. But it did also make the game less immersive than some other games, because it doesn't draw you into the game like some other more realistic art styles would. So what's my verdict on Trials of Fire? Overall, I think it's a good roguelite with great core gameplay. It uses tactical gameplay elements with RPG and deck builder elements in a novel and satisfying way. That's what drew me into this game in the first place, and that's what will keep me playing more of this game in the future. However, there are some negatives of the game as well that made me not want to play it that often, and it made it not the most bingeable game for me. Most notably, the pacing of the game feels slow, and certain game mechanics such as the overworld and accompanying events felt monotonous and tedious after a while. Additionally, it's a little hard to create satisfying builds than I would like in this game than I can in some other card game roguelites. When you do create a good build, it's incredibly rewarding. Still, I would recommend the game to people who are looking for a new tactical or card game roguelite, as long as you aren't looking for a more fast-paced game or you don't mind that it's a little harder to create those builds. Please like this video to help me on the algorithm, and thanks for watching.